19, I followed Uncle Clyde into the Blackroot Ridge coal roads at dusk. The valley opened into a moonlit clearing.
I didn't dare breathe. They were listening to something under the ground. Something alive in the ash pit.
I was 19 when my Uncle Clyde asked if I wanted to learn how to track deer the way our family used to do it. Quiet, slow, reading the patterns of the ridge instead of relying on cheap store-bought calls like everyone else in town. I was young enough to believe he meant it, old enough to sense something off in the way he spoke. He didn't look at me when he asked. Just packed his old canvas bag, slung the rifle he rarely fired over his shoulder, and said we'd go before sunset. The man had always been strange, but mountain strange. Kept his back to the tree line, listened more than he talked, stayed out of town for long stretches. Folks said he'd seen something years back and never quite came back from it. I chalked it up to the usual Appalachian rumors. We walked the old coal road that threaded under Blackroot Ridge, a place my father never let me wander near. The air felt thick and damp, heavy with the smell of rotting leaves. The mountain had a way of swallowing sound, the kind of silence where you hear your own blood moving. My uncle walked ahead without speaking. Every now and then he'd tap the side of his leg, as if signaling me to slow down or stay close. Signals I didn't know the meaning of but followed anyway. It was nearly dark when we reached the stretch where the ridge opened into a valley. The place looked dead. No birds, no deer prints, not even the usual churn of raccoon tracks along the mud. The ground was too smooth, as if the forest swept its own floor. That should have been my first warning. My uncle stopped suddenly and raised his hand, palm flat. I froze. He leaned close and whispered, "Stay low. No more talking." His voice sounded tight, thin, like a string pulled too hard. I tried to ask why, but his expression made my throat close. Whatever he brought me out here for had nothing to do with deer. We moved downhill, crouched, weaving between brush until the trees thinned. That was when I saw them, the 5 figures standing in a rough circle around a sunken pit. No fire, no lanterns, just the pale wash of the moon catching the tops of their heads. They didn't chant or sway or do anything I'd expect from a group gathered around a pit at night. They were still, too still. Their heads tipped slightly like they were listening to something under the soil. I remember thinking how wrong their posture looked, stiff like puppets whose strings were pulled too tight. Before I could retreat, my uncle's hand shot out and gripped my arm hard enough to bruise. He leaned into my ear, breath trembling. "Don't step back. They'll hear the shift." "Hear what?" I whispered. "The ground," he breathed. "They feed it. Every winter. What it remembers." I didn't understand, but his tone made my stomach drop. The valley smelled like wet stone and something older, deeper, like the inside of a sinkhole that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. The pit was filled with ash, but no embers. Ash like something had been burned and burned again. It dipped strangely, not like a dug hole but like the earth had collapsed inward. Then one of the figures knelt. The moment their knee touched the soil, a deep vibration rolled beneath my boots. Slow at first, like a distant truck, then stronger. The ground shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Something below it moved. Pushing, stretching, waking. A long exhale seeped from the pit, warm and damp, brushing my face with the unmistakable sensation of breath. The smell of it almost made me gag. Not decay. Not sulfur. Just warmth. Human warmth. The other 4 figures dropped to their knees in unison. No communication. No signal. Just immediate obedience. That was when the pit cracked. A dull snap split the air as the center of the ash sank, then split open along a jagged seam. Something pale moved inside the fissure. Slow at first, then reaching. I saw fingers. Too thin, too long, bending wrong, like branches softened by rot. They curled out of the earth, stretching as if waking from a long, hungry sleep. My uncle pushed me flat behind a fallen log, his whole body shaking. "Don't breathe too loud," he whispered, clutching the back of my jacket as if he could push me into the soil if he had to. "Don't let it sense you." Sense me. The word lodged in my ribs. Below us, the figures began murmuring. Not chanting, whispering as if calming something. One reached toward the emerging hand, offering their wrist like someone offering grain to livestock. I didn't see teeth. I didn't see a mouth. But I heard something latch. A wet, soft sound, a child learning to suck through a straw. The figure didn't flinch. They bowed deeper. Another pale limb reached up. The ground under us beat faintly, rhythmic, like the mountain itself had a heartbeat. My uncle's nails dug into my arm. We're leaving. Now. He dragged me backward, slow at first, then faster once the forest thickened. I didn't look back, though every instinct screamed at me to check if anything followed. We didn't talk until we reached the coal road. By then the night had grown colder, as if whatever rose from the pit had sucked the warmth from the valley. What was that? I finally whispered. He wiped a shaking hand across his mouth. Something older than the ridge. Older than people. Something the old families learned not to disturb. But they were feeding it, I said. Why? So it sleeps, he whispered. So it doesn't remember the rest of us. Some winters, the mountain wakes hungry. I tried to laugh, thinking he was messing with me, spinning old country stories the way mountain folks do when they want to scare the young ones. But he didn't smile. Didn't blink. He just stared into the tree-lane, listening like he expected footsteps to follow us out. We didn't speak the rest of the walk home. For weeks I pretended nothing happened. Told myself it was some kind of ritual, some twisted backwoods gathering I wasn't meant to see. But the image of that pale reaching arm wouldn't leave me. The way the ground inhaled. The way the figures moved like they were answering something older than their own thoughts. The first night I heard the exhale was a month later. I was lying in bed when a warm, damp breath rolled through my open window, carrying the same smell as that pit. Wet stone, rotted leaves, something living beneath earth. I froze. The night outside was silent. Not a dog barking. Not a cricket. Just the slow, steady sound of something breathing. My uncle wouldn't answer his phone. Sometimes I think about that night and wonder if the mountain marked me the moment I stepped into that valley. Whether those people knew we were watching. Whether something beneath the soil did too. The breath comes every winter now. Not every night. Not long. Just a single slow exhale drifting through the darkness, reminding me the ridge is awake, and that it remembers I was there. I started running the old marrow supply route when I was 24, mostly because no one else wanted it. The pay was decent, and the company truck had a heater stronger than the one in my trailer, so I didn't complain. But anyone who's lived around the deep ridges knows that some places don't like being crossed before dawn. Old Marrow was one of them. A narrow, shoulderless road cutting through 30 miles of oak and pine that never got enough sunlight to dry the ground. Even in summer it smelled like cold mud. In winter, everything felt dead except the wind that slid between the trees like it was carrying a warning. The morning it happened, the air felt heavier than usual. Thick like fog, but without the moisture. My headlights barely touched the road ahead. Every shadow looked alive. I told myself I was just tired. I had left earlier than normal, around 3:30 a.m., because a storm was moving in later that day. I didn't want to be on that road once the rains hit. The radio crackled with static, then cut out completely 10 minutes in. That wasn't unusual, but the silence that followed felt different, like the woods were waiting for something. About 6 miles into the route, I saw the first lantern. It sat on the right side of the road, placed neatly on packed dirt. The flame inside burned a soft orange, dim but steady. Too steady. No sway, no flicker, even as my truck passed close enough that the air should have disturbed it. I slowed instinctively, leaning forward to get a better look. That's when I saw the next one. And then the next. Lanterns lined both sides of the road in evenly spaced intervals, stretching into the dark like a path meant for someone who wasn't me. I had delivered to enough remote homes to know when someone was signaling for help, but this wasn't that. There were too many, too symmetrical, too intentional. And each flame had that same stillness, like they weren't burning but glowing from something solid. I eased my foot off the gas without fully realizing it. That was when the figures stepped out. They emerged between the trees without sound. 5 of them on each side at first, then more behind. All of them wore white masks, expressionless except for the jagged eye holes that looked like they'd been cut with a dull knife. The masks were crude, almost childlike, but the way they were worn wasn't playful. Each figure stood perfectly still, facing the road, bodies stiff and straight like they were bracing against an invisible force. I kept rolling forward at maybe 10 miles an hour, wanting to believe they were hunters or some kind of winter festival group. But hunters didn't stand silent at 4 a.m. wearing homemade masks, and no festival would run out here where even cell towers refused to work. One of them stepped closer as my truck crawled past. I could see the cuts around the mask, thin slashes on the wood where someone had tried to widen the eye holes. The edges were splintered. I could see the pale of their cheek through the gap, but not enough to see a full face. Whoever they were, they didn't move to block me. They just watched. I didn't breathe until the lanterns ended 40 seconds later. I told myself to keep going, that once the sun came up I'd check to see if someone had played some bizarre prank. But a mile later, my headlights landed on another truck parked at an angle on the shoulder. Engine running. Passenger door shut. Driver's door wide open. The dome light glowed a tired yellow over the interior. It was Ray's truck. Ray ran the route before me. He'd been doing this since the late 90s, and he was the kind of man who carried 2 knives and a crowbar just in case. Seeing his truck empty with the door open triggered something cold in my gut. I pulled over behind him, leaving my own engine running. The woods around us felt wrong. Too still. No wind, no insects, nothing but the low hum of both engines. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots sounding too loud in the silence. When I looked into Ray's truck, I saw the mask. It lay on the driver's seat, white and crude like the others, but the inside looked damp. Condensation lined the hollow where the eyes would press against skin. The bottom edge had moisture beading on it, like it had just been removed from someone's face. And when I touched it, the mask was warm. Not from the truck heater. Warm like a person had been wearing it seconds earlier. I froze, fingers still on the rough wood. The warmth wasn't fading. It felt like it was getting warmer, like the mask itself was exhaling heat. A faint smell hit me then. Salt, sweat, and something metallic like old pennies. It reminded me of blood, but not fresh. Blood that had dried hours ago. Footsteps shifted behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, and saw them. Faces watching from the ditch. Not standing this time. Crouching. Their masks angled just above the grass, eye holes staring straight at me. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more deeper in the dark. Not moving. Not blinking. Waiting. I backed toward my truck slowly, keeping my eyes on them. The closest figure tilted its head a fraction, like it was curious what I'd do next. That small motion felt worse than if they'd all charged at me. It meant they understood I was afraid. It meant they liked watching. When my hand found my door handle, one of the figures rose to its full height. I still don't know if it was a man or a woman. The body was wrapped loosely in dark fabric that blended into the night. The mask was identical to the one in Ray's truck. Same uneven cuts, same crude shape. But this one had something smeared around the mouth. Something dark. I didn't look long enough to be sure what it was. I slammed my door, floored the accelerator, and tore down the road so fast my tires fishtailed. The figures didn't chase. I don't think they needed to. They watched me go, those blank white masks fading into the dark behind the orange glow of the lanterns. I didn't stop until the first hint of daylight touched the tops of the trees. I filed a report with the county later that day, but they said Ray probably walked off or hitched a ride and that the masks were probably kids messing around. I didn't argue. There are conversations you don't force on people who don't want to understand. Ray was never found. His truck was eventually towed, but no one claimed what was inside it. The mask I'd touched was gone long before the authorities got there. Winter came early that year. And with it, the lanterns returned. People driving that road after me said they saw them. Same dull orange flames, same perfect spacing, same unmoving glow. But I never went back. Couldn't. Sometimes, in the dead of night when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can smell that same metallic warmth again. Like someone is holding a mask close behind me. They're waiting. And the worst part is knowing they already chose someone once, and they might not be done choosing. I never wanted to go into Red Elk Mine. Everyone in my family had worked there at some point. My grandfather, 2 of my uncles, even my dad before he hurt his back. I grew up hearing the stories around kitchen tables and porch steps, about the dust that clung to your lungs and the tunnels that twisted like the insides of some buried animal. But I also heard the other stories, the ones told in low voices, the ones meant for after dark. Stories about voices deeper in the mine, humming like a choir with no song, no melody. Just one long vibrating note that made your bones feel hollow. I always thought those were just tales meant to keep kids like me from wandering. And for 19 years, it worked. It wasn't until my cousin Blake dragged me into one of his dumb ideas that I ended up standing at the rusted gate of Red Elk, staring into a darkness that felt thicker than anything I'd known. We were with a group of kids who liked to sneak into the woods at night, daring each other to climb fire towers or break into old barns. They called it an initiation, but really it was boredom, teenage invincibility, and a need to impress each other. Blake put his hand on my shoulder and said, "All you gotta do is take the tunnel down past the elevator shaft and come back with something. Anything. Piece of timber, old glove, whatever." I wanted to say no. I should have said no. But they were all watching, and pride is a stupid thing when you're young. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the air changed. It was colder. Not the kind of cold that comes from shade or stone, but a draining cold, as if the tunnel itself was pulling heat from my skin. My breath felt thin, tight, like each inhale had to fight its way in. My flashlight beam cut through the dust in narrow, shaky lines, and every sound I made felt too loud in the stillness. Red Elk smelled like wet metal and old machinery, but there was something else under it. Something sour like mildew mixed with old sweat. The deeper I went, the more that smell settled into the back of my throat. The first 100 feet were easy enough. Those were the portions of the mine people used to sneak into years ago, before the county welded the gates shut. Old graffiti still clung to the walls, white and orange spray paint half faded under layers of grime. Past that point, the tunnels narrowed, and the walls began to sweat. It made them look alive, like they were breathing slow and steady. By the time I reached the collapsed elevator shaft, the temperature had dropped so much my fingers were numb around the flashlight. I could see my breath drifting in pale clouds. I thought about turning back, grabbing a rock or a rusted bolt, and telling the others it counted. But the stupid part of me, the part that didn't want Blake to call me scared for the rest of my life, kept pushing me forward. That's when I heard it. A humming, soft at first, like wind sliding across a bottle mouth. I froze. It didn't sound like wind. It was too steady, too controlled. The sound grew, filling the tunnel with a low vibration that made the beam of my flashlight tremble. I told myself it had to be an echo, old machinery settling, water dripping into some metallic pocket. But then the humming changed. It layered, deepened, became multiple voices blending into one. A chord without structure. A choir without breath. I should have run. Every part of me knew that. But something about the sound held me there. Not entranced, just terrified to move. I lifted the flashlight, and that's when I saw them. A group of people stood shoulder to shoulder against the far wall of the chamber, facing away from me. Their clothes hung off their bodies like wet rags, heavy with black dust. Some wore old miners' uniforms, the kind I recognized from my grandfather's trunk. Others were dressed in plain work clothes. Their bodies were too still, too rigid, like they'd been standing there for hours. The humming was coming from them, but not from their mouths. Their jaws hung open slightly, slack, lifeless. Yet the sound wasn't passing through their lips. It came from behind the wall they were facing. Something was on the other side. I took a small step back, and a pebble skittered under my boot. The humming stuttered. Not stopped, just faltered like a breath catching in someone's throat. Then all at once the group turned. Not slowly. Not with any natural movement. They shifted as one, like a single body with too many limbs. All their heads turned toward me, but their eyes didn't lock onto mine. They stared past me, up the tunnel toward the entrance. Their eyes were cloudy, unfocused, like they weren't seeing the physical world at all. A sound rose behind the wall. A long, hollow exhale, like air being pushed through a deep cave. The tunnel under my feet vibrated with it. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The air warmed suddenly, damp and thick, like the breath of something enormous. The figures stepped forward. That broke whatever shock had pinned me in place. I bolted, flashlight beam jerking across stone and rusted rail tracks. I could hear the humming behind me again, rising sharply, discordant now, like it was angry. The tunnel walls echoed it, bending the sound until it seemed to come from every direction. I kept running, nearly tripping on loose timber, my lungs burning from the sudden heat. When I finally saw the faint gray glow of the entrance, something behind me exhaled again, longer this time. A pressure pushed against my back like wind, but too warm and too steady to be wind. The figures weren't chasing me. I never looked back to check, but I knew. The sound alone told me they weren't moving with footsteps. They were moving with vibration, like they were part of the tunnel itself. When I burst outside, I hit the dirt and scrambled until the cold morning air bit into my face. Blake and the others were still there, laughing, expecting me to pop out with some broken mind trinket. But their laughter died fast when they saw my face. I couldn't speak at first. My whole body felt like it was still vibrating, like the humming had settled under my skin. Blake walked toward the entrance just to look, but I grabbed his jacket and yanked him back so hard he nearly fell. I don't remember yelling, but my throat was raw by the time I managed to say, "Don't go in there. Ever." The county resealed the mine a week later. No explanation. No memo. Just welded plates and a new sign. I drove past once just to see. At dusk, when the light bends strange in the valleys, I heard it again, a soft hum rolling out from behind the sealed metal, like a voice shaped from stone and dust. Some nights, when the wind is low and my house settles into its old wooden groans, the hum slips through the walls. Not loud. Never loud. Just enough to let me know the choir is still down there. And whatever breathes behind that wall is still waiting. I never should have gone back there, but curiosity had a stubborn grip on me that night. My grandmother's warnings had always carried the weight of real danger, but when you're 17, warnings feel more like dares than protections. St. Weller's Chapel had been abandoned, or so the old folks said, but I knew from whispered rumors that it still hosted gatherings on moonless nights. I didn't know what drew me more, the fear of seeing something I shouldn't or the certainty that the stories were true. I parked my car on the ridge above the trail and trudged down through the frost-bitten underbrush. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, the kind of smell that clings to your hair and makes your chest tighten. Every snapped twig underfoot sounded deafening, and I kept expecting someone, or something, to leap from the shadows. By the time I reached the chapel, the sky had folded into an inky black. There were no stars, no moonlight, just the heavy, oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. I crouched behind a collapsed cedar beam, watching the basement doorway. It yawned open like a black wound in the building's foundation. Slowly, people began to emerge. They moved with a purpose I couldn't have imagined, carrying wooden bowls cradled in both hands. The substance in them was thick, dark, almost black, and it clung to the edges of the wood like it had weight beyond gravity. They filed past the doorway without a word, without hesitation, and I realized my breath had frozen in my chest. Each step toward the ravine was careful, measured, as though the earth itself demanded silence. I followed them cautiously, keeping behind a screen of trees and low brush. The procession moved with an eerie grace, their bare feet silent on the frost-covered ground. When they reached the ravine's edge, they stopped and bent over the cliff, tipping the bowls forward. I thought it would make a sound, the liquid hitting the rocks below, but there was nothing audible, only a low tremor beneath my feet. The forest itself seemed to respond. The ground pulsed, subtle at first, then more insistently, like a heartbeat buried deep under layers of soil. And then the hands appeared. They emerged from the darkness of the ravine below, pale, dirt-caked, reaching up eagerly. They caught every drop with a precision that was almost reverent. The people on the edge didn't flinch, didn't step back. They simply waited, tilting their bowls until empty, then straightening with a slow, deliberate bow. I froze, every nerve screaming at me to move, but fear held me rooted. I was watching a ritual older than any memory I'd known of this place, a communion with something hidden beneath the soil. My fingers itched to run. My heart felt like it might burst. The stillness was suffocating, every sound in the forest muted except for my own ragged breathing. And then it happened. A twig cracked under my foot. The sound was small, almost timid, but it was enough. Every head snapped toward me in perfect unison. Their eyes didn't blink, didn't falter. They didn't even see me fully. They were focused, empty, and calculating, as if my presence had been noted in some ledger I couldn't understand. Panic finally broke me free. I ran. My legs tore through the underbrush, thorns slicing my arms and legs, but I didn't care. Every branch I stumbled through seemed determined to hold me, to slow my escape, but the pull of survival was stronger. Behind me I could hear nothing. No shouting, no footsteps. When I finally reached the road above, my chest heaving and my clothes smeared with mud and sap, I turned back only once. The chapel was quiet, dark, and unassuming. But I could feel the weight of eyes, not just human eyes, lingering on me from the darkness below. Even now, the memory is sharp enough to make me flinch. Sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can smell that sour, heavy tang of the ravine, the damp, coppery scent of something buried and fed in the dark. It clings to my clothes in my dreams, and in the corner of my eye, I catch fleeting shapes that vanish when I look straight at them. I tell people I didn't see anything, that it was just a night hike gone wrong, but the truth sits in my chest like a stone. Something lives in that ravine, fed regularly, watched over by silent witnesses in masks and bowls. And the chapel, far from empty, still waits patient like a predator crouched in its den, for the next soul foolish enough to wander close. Even years later, I avoid that trail, avoid that place entirely, but the memory never leaves. It's in the way shadows stretch across my walls at night, in the way the wind whispers through the pines, in the low, wet shudder of the earth when the world is still. And I know that if I ever return, or if someone else follows the same path, I'll witness it again. The slow procession, the dark bowls, the hands rising from the earth. And I'll know, as I did that night, that the forest has a hunger, and the chapel, quiet and unassuming, has its keepers. I hadn't planned to stay out that late. My plan was simple. Pitch a tent near the water, fish through the afternoon, maybe cook a small dinner over the campfire, and sleep under the stars. Pine Hook Lake is isolated in late fall, the kind of place where the sun disappears early and the air smells sharp, almost metallic when it's cold. I set up close to the shore where the trees thinned, giving a clear view of the water, and settled in, thinking about the quiet, the way the wind whispered through the pines. It felt peaceful at first, almost absurdly perfect. That was before the torches appeared. I woke sometime after midnight. My head throbbed a little from the cold, my eyes adjusting to the faint moonlight, when I saw them, torchlight flickering along the ridgeline above the lake. At first, I thought someone was hiking, but the movement didn't make sense. The figures walked in strict, synchronized steps, 3 forward, pause, 3 forward, pause, like soldiers on a drill or marionettes on a string. The torches didn't smoke, didn't cast the usual wisps of flame. They glowed a dull, consistent yellow that almost seemed suspended in the air. My pulse raced as I realized the entire line was moving toward the cliff that overlooked the water, directly above my tent. I wanted to run, but some part of me stayed rooted, watching. The figures stopped at the edge, and in perfect unison, each raised a hand and pointed toward the lake. I thought it was a trick of the shadows, until ripples appeared in the water, concentric and precise, as if a giant hand beneath the surface was testing the lake's skin. A hum began, low and resonant, not coming from any throat I could see. The vibration shook the ground beneath my sleeping bag, enough to rattle small stones along the shore. I could feel it in my chest, like a warning pulse. Then the water changed. A column of bubbles erupted at the center of the lake, carrying a thick, sulphurous stench. I gagged slightly, the smell bitter and clinging, like rot hidden beneath layers of cold water. The figures didn't flinch. They remained kneeling, their fingers rigidly pointing, eyes fixed on the surface as if expecting it to answer. The hum continued, deepening, almost musical, like some ritual older than memory. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the wind, a reflection on the water, but the weight of the moment made me realize it wasn't natural. Something in that lake was being called or fed by the line above, and I was witnessing it. Fear finally broke my paralysis. I packed as quietly as I could, slipping my backpack over my shoulders, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. Every snap of a branch underfoot sounded like thunder, and the hum seemed to follow me, bending the air in ways I didn't understand. As I reached the cover of the trees, I glanced back, and every single torch was turned directly at me, flames leaning forward like a compass needle locked on my location. My heart nearly stopped. I ran blindly through the brush, twisting over roots and fallen limbs, until the torchlight receded above the ridge, but the vibration, the hum, lingered in my chest. I haven't gone back, and I never will. Pinehook Lake sits in that valley quietly, deceptively still. Locals speak in half-whispers about the lake's depth, saying it's bottomless, that nothing sleeps there, not entirely. I've tried to convince myself I imagined it, that the combination of isolation, darkness, and too much coffee had conjured the torches and the hum. But even weeks later, I dream about the ripples, about the column of bubbles, about the pointing hands frozen against the night. The smell of sulfur follows me into my apartment, faint but unmistakable, like a warning I didn't heed. Some nights, when I close my eyes, I can hear that deep droning hum, low and insistent. And sometimes I imagine the torch flames turning toward me again, bending as though the lake itself has marked me, chosen me in some way I can't comprehend. I don't know what happens down there, or what requires that devotion. I only know that the watchers are patient, silent, and that the lake waits. It waits for someone else to stumble too close, to see the ritual in the cold, still dark. And I hope it doesn't notice me again, though part of me knows it probably already has. Even now, I avoid the roads that pass near the ridge, avoid telling anyone too much, because I've learned that some truths are safer in whispers. But when the wind shifts and carries the faint scent of wet pine and decay, I can feel the memory crawl under my skin, reminding me that Pinehook Lake isn't quiet, isn't still. And that night, the water responded to the watchers, and maybe it will again. Maybe it already has, and I'll never know who or what answers. I had always thought inheriting the farmhouse on Harvest Hill would be a blessing, a quiet retreat from the city, a place to breathe the crisp mountain air and escape the hum of traffic. When I first arrived, the house was empty, stripped bare, but it had character. The floors creaked, the walls smelled of old pine and dust, and the windows reflected the late autumn light in a way that felt almost watchful. I started poking around, pulling up a few loose floorboards near the corner of the main room, and that's when I found them. Small bone carvings arranged in spirals. Each piece was delicate, smooth, and oddly precise, like someone had spent hours shaping them with care. I assumed they were relics of some eccentric hunter or a local craftsman with a strange hobby. I stacked them in a box, curious but not yet unnerved. A week passed quietly. I was just beginning to settle in when, at dusk, I noticed them. Men in plain clothing, gray, featureless, almost blending into the twilight, were walking across the fields toward the farmhouse. There was no sound to their approach, no conversation, no rustle of leaves underfoot, and I had the sense that the world itself bent slightly around them. They reached the house and moved along the outer walls, flat palms brushing against the weathered siding. One of them whispered something low, almost inaudible, and the ground trembled under my feet. I stepped out onto the porch, my voice shaking as I asked what they wanted, and they didn't even glance at me. Their eyes were fixed on the house, intent and patient, like they were watching something alive and secret inside its walls. The man at the front, the one who seemed to lead, said simply, "The place remembers its purpose." That night I couldn't sleep. The air felt thick, charged, and I kept thinking of the bone spirals under the floorboards. When I stepped outside, my heart caught in my chest. More spirals had appeared, carved carefully into the soil, each one aligned precisely toward the barn at the edge of the field. I traced them with my eyes, each curve and line pointing like a guide, and a cold dread settled over me. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I understood instinctively that it was old, deliberate, and dangerous. I waited for sunrise before approaching the barn, nerves taut and teeth clenched against the cold wind. The center of the floor had collapsed slightly, revealing a dark cavity below. My stomach turned as I imagined what might lie hidden in that hollow, why the carvings had pointed to it, and why the men had been so silent, so exact in their movements. I left the property that day before nightfall, packing only what I could carry and ignoring the hollow ache of the farmhouse that had, somehow, rooted itself in my memory. Behind me, I could see the men moving again across the fields, walking toward the barn in perfect formation. They carried no tools, spoke no words, but there was a ritual in their precision, an understanding that I was only beginning to glimpse. The land was theirs long before the deed said it was mine, and I realized then that Harvest Hill wasn't abandoned. It had never been mine to begin with. Even now I can feel the weight of it, the spirals of bone, the tremor in the earth, the sense of unseen eyes tracking movement in the twilight. The farmhouse sits in my memory as if it had inhaled me and refused to let go, a place that remembers more than I ever will. Sometimes in the wind, I hear the low scrape of bone against soil, the distant echo of footsteps that move in synchronization with my own heartbeat, and I understand, faintly and too late, that some land remembers, and some purposes endure long after the living have walked away. I had been driving down the old ridge road late that night, the fog so thick it seemed to pour off the hills like smoke. My truck had given out halfway through Ash Valley, a place locals barely speak of anymore, and I had no choice but to leave it behind and walk for help. The valley was a wasteland of charred timber and blackened earth, remnants of a fire that swept through decades ago. Even the wind smelled of smoke, bitter and persistent, lingering in the corners of my nose and throat. The road beneath my boots felt uneven, eaten by frost and ash, and every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the oppressive quiet. I hadn't walked more than a quarter mile when I heard them. Footsteps. Slow, methodical, moving in perfect rhythm with one another. My chest tightened, my heart thundering in my ears. Through the fog, shadowy shapes began to materialize. Figures entirely coated in gray ash that clung to their clothes, hair, and skin. Their eyes were closed, yet their movements were deliberate, practiced, almost ceremonial. Each carried a small urn that glowed with a faint orange light, smoldering embers that seemed alive in their palms. There was no sound besides the synchronized steps and the faint hiss of the burning embers. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but curiosity anchored me to the road, watching them emerge from the fog like ghosts of a fire that refused to die. They gathered around a mound of blackened soil near the center of the valley. As they circled it, the mound pulsed with a rhythm that mimicked a lung, expanding and contracting as though breathing. Heat radiated outward, rippling through the freezing air, and I could see the steam rising off the ash around it. One by one, they tilted their urns, pouring glowing embers onto the mound. Each ember sizzled as it touched the soil, and the mound seemed to respond, the pulsing growing stronger with every addition. The sight was mesmerizing, horrifying, and I realized I was witnessing a ritual I could neither understand nor escape. Suddenly, one figure broke from the circle. He walked directly toward me, eyes still closed, face blank yet purposeful. My stomach twisted as he extended a hand, placing a warm piece of charcoal into my palm. The heat seeped into my skin, a strange living sensation that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. He leaned close and whispered almost inaudibly, "It chooses." Before I could respond, I dropped the charcoal and it skittered across the frozen soil. Immediately, several heads in the circle turned toward me. Their eyes remained shut, but I felt their awareness as surely as if they were staring into my soul. I ran, boots slipping on the ash-laden ground, branches whipping at my face, the fog thickening around me. The rhythmic march echoed behind me, unwavering, relentless. When I finally reached the edge of the valley, the fog thinned, the first glimpse of moonlight revealing the trees and fields beyond. My palms still tingled from the warmth of the charcoal, and when I looked down, a faint dark mark remained, seared into my skin. Days later, it hadn't faded, as though the valley itself had branded me. I never spoke of it to anyone, fearing disbelief or worse, a suspicion that the valley had not finished with me yet. Even now, years later, I feel the memory press in when the wind shifts just right, carrying a faint smell of smoke and burnt earth. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I can hear footsteps in the fog outside my window, slow and deliberate, and I remember the warmth of that charcoal, the pulsing mound, and the whisper that chose me, marking me as someone who had seen too much, yet understood nothing. The valley waits, patient, eternal, and I know that its procession will continue long after I am gone, feeding the fire that never truly died. After my father passed, I inherited more questions than memories. He had spent years pastoring a small church in Hollow Bend before abruptly quitting and refusing to speak about it. The silence around that chapter of his life had always been heavy, filled with his clipped warnings and averted gazes whenever I asked. When he died, the weight of curiosity finally became unbearable. I drove the narrow, twisting roads to Hollow Bend on a late autumn afternoon, the sky dull gray and the air smelling faintly of rot and wet leaves. The church sat on a hill that overlooked the river bend, its steeple dark against the sky, weathered but intact. The surrounding field was overgrown, and yet there was something off. Fresh footprints pressed into the mud, melted wax from candles glinting faintly in the fading light, and a metallic tang that lingered on the air, subtle but unmistakable. It was as if someone or something had been expecting me. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the worn wood floor. The pews had been rearranged, forming a rough circle around the pulpit, as though the space itself had been reshaped for some unspoken ritual. On the pulpit lay a book, thick and leather-bound, its pages opened and covered in names repeated in varying handwriting. My father's name appeared dozens of times, each instance etched with care, some neat, some jagged. I flipped through the pages slowly, a chill crawling up my spine. The air shifted, and a cold draft swept through the building, carrying the faint smell of iron and decay. Above me, the loft creaked. Soft footsteps pattered, hesitant yet deliberate, and I froze, trying to tell myself it was just the wind, or my imagination. Then they came down the stairs. A group of people, modern in dress but somehow incongruously out of place, moved with deliberate calm. Their faces were expressionless, features fixed in a way that made my stomach turn. They were quiet, but the weight of their presence filled the church. The leader approached, eyes steady and voice low, almost measured. "Your father delivered the final sermon," he said. "You were expected to continue." My heart pounded, my throat tight. I had no words, no defense, only the creeping dread that the air itself had thickened, pressing against me. The congregation knelt around me, forming a circle that radiated intent. A rhythmic thumping began, subtle at first, barely audible, but growing in intensity. It wasn't music or drums, it was organic, as though something alive pulsed beneath the floorboards, breathing in tandem with the circle. My hand shook. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the pews, and then I saw it. The pulpit's book, its pages flipping gently, as if turned by a breeze that had no source. Names continued to appear, filling the lines in real time, my own name emerging over and over. I realized the ritual was ongoing, alive, and somehow aware of me. Panic took hold. I ran, ignoring the soft footsteps that followed, ignoring the oppressive weight of unseen eyes on my back, and I burst out into the cold twilight. The church loomed behind me, silent but waiting. Even now, the book haunts me. Every few months, a new page appears in my mailbox, filled with my name. The lines are neat, repeated, endless, a reminder that I cannot outrun whatever connection my father left behind in Hollow Bend. I avoid the roads that lead near the old church, avoid even thinking of the circle of kneeling figures, yet in my dreams, I feel the pulse of that space, the heavy rhythm beneath the floor, the weight of expectation pressing on me. I know that what happened there isn't finished, and in some distant, unknowable way, the church, and whatever it serves, still watches.